Just making sure you had a minister in the chair.
I did. Thank you. I'm calling Julianne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak on Part 1 of the Custom and Excise Budget Measures Motor Spirits Amendment Bill. What Clause 4 of Part 1 of this bill does is say that the petrol tax will be going up 3 cents a litre every year for the next 3 years, starting this year. And essentially, what I'd like to focus on in this part of the bill is the reasons why the government has to put up the petrol tax. It's very clear from the regulatory impact statement that the government has to put up the petrol tax because people are driving less. They haven't been driving as much for over 5 years now, and that is due to a number of factors. It's due to oil prices being much higher. It's due to the fact that we haven't seen the anticipated level of economic growth. It's due to the demographic factors, like younger people, younger generations are waiting longer to get their driver's license, and they're less interested in owning a car. They're much more interested in owning a smartphone, connecting with people in other ways, living in vibrant towns and cities, urban areas where they can walk and cycle, take public transport, and not be forced to spend thousands of dollars a year owning a car, maintaining it, taking it in for a woof. They would like smarter transport options. And what's been happening over the past few years, we know from data from Ministry of Transport, is that public transport boardings are up. So I'd like to explain the minister's, to the minister, based on his comments earlier, how it is that an economic instrument works. What the minister said during his speech was that back when petrol was very expensive, lots of people took public transport. So wouldn't we expect that, given that petrol has become much more expensive, the price of it has doubled in the last decade, and the International Monetary Fund says we can quite realistically expect it to double again in the next 10 years. So wouldn't we expect that even more New Zealanders are going to be wanting to take public transport, are going to be wanting to walk and cycle and leave the car at home if they can? And wouldn't we want to be putting most of the transport budget into infrastructure that gives New Zealanders the choice, that gives them the ability to avoid paying huge amounts of money on petrol? Wouldn't we want to give them those choices? And that's not what the government is doing. What they are doing is putting up the petrol tax and then saying we're going to put the vast majority of this money that we raise, the revenue we raise through the petrol tax, into a few motorways that carry a relatively small percentage of vehicle trips, about 4% of daily vehicle trips collectively on all the roads of national significance that remain to be built. We're putting all of that money into a few very expensive solutions that don't actually solve a problem. Because vehicle trips are down, there are smarter ways to deal with congestion, and part of the way that we deal with congestion and safety is actually investing in alternatives so New Zealanders can take public transport, walk and cycle, which is a safer way of getting around, reduces road accidents, reduces the cost of road maintenance, and reduces the need to expand road capacity because it moves more people at peak time for a lower cost. Wouldn't that be a rational economic approach to the future of our transport investment for New Zealand? And hey, there's lots of good things about putting up petrol tax. See, the great thing about an economic instrument is that it encourages efficiency. So we could expect, if New Zealanders get enough advance warning, that petrol is going to be more expensive in the future, petrol tax is going to be higher. Therefore, when they look at buying a new car, they'll consider that, and they might buy more fuel-efficient cars. But the other impact we could expect them to, the other behavior we could expect them to respond with is to drive even less. So why would we be spending the vast majority of the money on a few new motorways when we know that putting up the price of the petrol tax and the oil price increasing anyway is going to lead to fewer people using the road and more people wanting to use public transport? And the minister claims that his government is spending money on new infrastructure for public transport. But if you look at the GPS, that budget, it's very, very clear that all of the money, or like 85% of the money on new infrastructure, is going on a few new motorways. There's a tiny percentage going on local roads, which means there'll be, and local roads, by the way, carry more than 50% of all the vehicle trips. So the minister erroneously believes, and this concerns me, that the Minister of Transport doesn't know how money is raised to spend on the transport network. 50% of all the funding that goes to local roads, to walking and cycling, to public transport is paid for by ratepayers. So we've got 50% of the traffic. Mr. Chair?
Julian Gender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've got over 50% of the traffic going on local roads, which are half paid for by ratepayers. And there are ratepayers who might decide, if they were going to pay directly, that they would rather walk and cycle and take public transport. But they don't have that option because central government is controlling the way all of the money is spent. And they're saying to local councils, we don't want you to spend money on walking and cycling, even though it's cost effective. We don't want you to spend money on local roads because we don't want you to raise rates. But we're going to put all this money into a few new roads, which don't go, by the way, from the farm gate to the port. It's a very, very bad analogy to say that somehow, because you're spending all of the money on a few new motorways, that that's going to help freight. Actually, a lot of our exporters are moving their freight by rail already, and they could do even more so. A lot of freight is on local roads, and yet the money available to local roads has been reduced because all of the money is being put into 3 very expensive duplications of existing motorways that is going to have very limited marginal return. So what we see is the government spending, they're putting up the petrol tax, and then they're not providing New Zealanders with options. And normally, when you're going to approach a tax like an economic instrument, you would say, okay, well, we want to encourage efficiency in our oil use. We want to future-proof our economy and our transport system to higher oil prices. So we're going to slowly but steadily increase the petrol tax, and we're going to put all of that money, or most of it, into alternatives so that people have the option to leave their car at home. That's going to cost New Zealand Inc. a whole lot less money. So although I often hear that roads are paid for by users, and therefore it's okay to be spending most of the petrol tax on a few motorways, they aren't the projects that are going to benefit most road users. They aren't the projects that are going to benefit New Zealand's economy. And we know this from the economic studies that have been done on them, which were completed nearly a year after the projects were announced. Most of the roads of all of the roads of national significance have never been subjected to Treasury's Better Business Case guidelines. Why is that? Because if they were, it would become very obvious you could achieve 90% of the benefits at a tiny fraction of the cost of building a flash new motorway, rather than just upgrading the existing road and getting some of the commuters off the roads. So what the National Party is doing is akin to putting up the tobacco tax, excise tax, and then spending all of that money on advertising for cigarettes and cigarette stores. What they're doing is, instead of giving people the option to avoid taking the car and to reduce their oil use, they're putting up the petrol tax and spending all of the money on projects that increase New Zealand's oil dependence. And it's not a smart approach, particularly given our current account deficit problem. Last year, New Zealand spent $8 billion importing oil to put in our cars and trucks. And New Zealander households and businesses spent over $3 billion on vehicles. Now, we're still importing the same quantity of oil we were importing 10 years ago, but we're paying twice as much for it. So our current account deficit, somewhere around $10 billion, is actually quite close to the amount, it's slightly less than the amount that we're spending importing vehicles and oil, which is about $11 billion last year. And that amount could increase rapidly if we see another oil price spike. So the national government is really missing an opportunity to reduce the oil dependence of our transport sector by investing in smart alternatives that would have longer lasting benefits. The minister put out a press release yesterday, I think it was, saying that some of the new investment in roads is resulting in time travel savings. Well, that's a very short-term approach to it. I mean, yeah, of course, as soon as you initially build the road, it seems like people are able to get there faster. What happens after 3 or 4 years? As the minister said, if you build it, they will come. So more people are going to move further away and put more pressure on those roads. Your time travel savings are not there 3 or 4 years after the project is built. And the question remains to be seen whether or not that traffic would have even happened if you hadn't built the road. Of course, if you make it cheaper and easier to drive, more people will drive. That doesn't mean it's the economically efficient outcome for the economy as a whole. And interestingly, there are centrist governments across the world, even right-wing governments, who see the economic opportunity of smart transport, and that's what they're investing in. There's cities all over the United States that are investing in walking and cycling because it's good for business, it's good for the economy. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'd think from listening to